A billionaire hires a black nanny for his mansion, but her family photo holds a shocking secret. What unexpected connection will be uncovered, and how will it impact their lives? And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. Richard Thompson's office commanded a view of Manhattan's skyline from the 50th floor of Thompson Industries headquarters. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his mahogany desk as he reviewed quarterly projections with his board of directors. His perfectly tailored suit and commanding presence reflected years of calculated business decisions that had built his empire. "Our Asian markets show a 15% increase," he stated, laser-focused on the presentation until his personal phone vibrated against the desk.
Once, twice,
3 times. His assistant knew better than to interrupt board meetings unless it concerned Emma. His 7-year-old daughter was his only priority above business. Richard held up his hand, silencing the ongoing discussion. "Excuse me, gentlemen." He stepped away from the conference table, turning toward the window. "What is it, Margaret?" "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Thompson, but Mrs. Peterson just quit. She said Emma's energy is too much for her at her age." Margaret's voice carried a hint of frustration. This was the 3rd nanny in 6 months. "However, I may have found someone perfect. Her name is Jasmine Carter. Her references are impeccable, and she's available to interview today." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. Finding reliable childcare had become increasingly difficult since Sarah's death 2 years ago. "Today? I have meetings until..." "Sir, Emma needs stability. Ms. Carter has a master's degree in child development and excellent recommendations from prominent families. She's different from the others." Something in Margaret's tone made Richard pause. "Different how?" A brief hesitation. "She's young, energetic, and African-American. I know that shouldn't matter, but given your social circle, I felt I should mention it." Richard's jaw tightened. He glanced at the board members waiting patiently, their expressions carefully neutral. "Schedule the interview for 6. And Margaret? Next time, lead with the qualifications." Across town, in a modest apartment in Harlem, Jasmine Carter stood before her mirror, adjusting her blazer. Her natural hair was pulled back neatly, professional but true to herself. On her dresser sat a worn photograph of her grandmother, Sarah May Carter, who had worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families in the 1960s. "I won't hide who I am, Grandma," Jasmine whispered, touching the photo. "You taught me better than that." Her grandmother's stories of discrimination and resilience had shaped her, instilling a quiet strength that radiated from within. Her phone buzzed with a message from the agency confirming the interview. Thompson Industries. Even in childcare circles, the name carried weight. She'd done her research. Richard Thompson, widowed father, self-made billionaire. The position would be demanding, but Jasmine had worked hard for her credentials. She wouldn't let preconceptions stand in her way. The Thompson mansion stood imposing against the evening sky. Jasmine's heels clicked against marble as the housekeeper led her through a foyer larger than her entire apartment. Original artwork adorned the walls, but what caught her attention were the empty spaces, spots where family photos should have been. Richard Thompson's study matched his reputation, imposing, meticulously organized, power in every detail. He rose from behind his desk as she entered, his expression neutral but evaluating. The tension in the room was immediate, years of societal prejudices and expectations hanging unspoken between them. "Ms. Carter." His handshake was firm, professional. "Your credentials are impressive." "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Eli education should be both structured and nurturing. Children need..." A sudden burst of laughter interrupted them. A small whirlwind with sandy blonde hair burst into the study, crayon drawings clutched in her hands. "Daddy, look what I made." Emma Thompson skidded to a stop, her eyes widening as she noticed Jasmine. Without hesitation, she bounded over. "I'm Emma. Do you like dragons? I drew one. It's purple because purple is the best color. Do you think purple is the best color?" "Emma," Richard started, his tone carrying a warning about interrupting. But Jasmine was already kneeling to Emma's level, her smile genuine. "Purple is amazing. But you know what makes it even better? When you add a little bit of blue to make it sparkle. Emma's eyes lit up. Can you show me, please? I have so many crayons in my room. Richard watched the interaction, something shifting in his expression. Emma hadn't connected with any previous candidates like this. His daughter's enthusiasm was genuine, uninhibited by the social prejudices that adults carried. Perhaps, he found himself saying, Miss Carter would like to see your art room, Emma. We can continue our discussion there. As they followed his energetic daughter, Richard observed Jasmine's natural interaction with Emma, her gentle guidance, the way she listened intently to every word. It challenged his preconceptions, forced him to confront his own biases. In the art room, surrounded by Emma's colorful creations, the formal interview facade began to crack. Jasmine showed Emma how to blend colors, their heads bent together over the drawing paper. The joy in his daughter's laughter was something Richard hadn't heard in too long. Miss Carter, he said, finally, his decision made. When can you start? The smile Jasmine gave him was professional, but carried a hint of triumph. I'm available immediately, Mr. Thompson. As they finalized the details, neither could have predicted how this simple hiring decision would unravel threads of the past, leading them down a path that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, identity, and healing old wounds. The morning after hiring Jasmine, Richard's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. News traveled fast in their social circle, and not everyone approved of his choice. He sat in his home office, scrolling through messages that ranged from concerned to openly critical. James Whitman, his longtime business partner, had sent a particularly pointed email about maintaining appropriate appearances and considering the company's image. A notification from page 6 caught his attention. Thompson Industries CEO makes controversial hiring choice. The article wasn't subtle in its implications, suggesting he was either trying to make a political statement or having some sort of crisis following his wife's death. Richard closed the browser with more force than necessary, his finger jabbing at the screen. Down the hall, the sound of Emma's laughter filtered through the heavy wooden doors. It was Jasmine's first official day, and despite the mounting pressure from his social circle, Richard couldn't deny the immediate positive change in his daughter's demeanor. His intercom buzzed. Mr. Thompson, the board members are requesting an emergency meeting to discuss recent developments. His assistant's voice carried a note of apology. Richard straightened his tie, steeling himself for the confrontation. Schedule it for 11. And Margaret? Send me Jasmine's complete background check and references. I want every detail. In Emma's playroom, Jasmine was experiencing a different kind of morning. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully arranging wooden blocks into an elaborate structure. Miss Jasmine, why does Tommy at school say his mom doesn't want him to play with Keisha because she looks like you? The question hung in the air, innocent, but heavy with implications. Jasmine set down the book she'd been holding, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes, Emma, people have ideas about others based on how they look. But that doesn't make those ideas right. But that's silly, Emma declared, adding another block to her tower. Keisha shares her cookies at lunch and knows all the best games. She's nice. You're right, it is silly, Jasmine agreed, watching Emma's face scrunch in concentration as she balanced another block. People are like your blocks here. They're all different shapes and colors, but they can build amazing things together. Emma beamed at the comparison, then frowned as her tower wobbled. Jasmine quickly studied it, their hands working together to stabilize the structure. The moment captured everything about childhood that adults seem to forget, the natural ability to see past superficial differences to find connection. In the Thompson Industries boardroom, Richard faced his critics. The room was tense, filled with the kind of silence that preceded difficult conversations. James Whitman cleared his throat, speaking first. Richard, we're concerned about the message this sends. The company is at a crucial point with the Asian merger. We can't afford any distractions. Richard's fingers drummed against the polished table. A distraction? You mean like how 3 different nannies in 6 months affected my ability to focus on work? Or how my daughter's happiness directly impacts my performance as CEO? Be reasonable. Another board member interjected. There were other candidates available. More suitable ones. More suitable? Richard's voice carried an edge. You mean white? Let's not pretend this is about anything else. But even as he defended his decision, doubt crept in. Was he being naive? Had he put his personal reputation and company at risk? The meeting dragged on, each argument hitting closer to home. Richard found himself second-guessing every interaction with Jasmine. Had he been too quick to hire her? Was he overcompensating, trying to prove something to himself? When he returned home that evening, he paused outside the kitchen. Emma and Jasmine were baking cookies, flour dusting their clothes. His daughter wore the kind of unreserved smile he hadn't seen since before Sarah's death. "Daddy," Emma called out, spotting him. "Miss Jasmine taught me fractions with measuring cups. And she says if you mix yellow food coloring with blue, it makes green. Can we try?" Jasmine looked up, meeting his gaze. There was something in her expression, a quiet dignity, an understanding of the challenges he'd faced today without him having to say a word. She didn't need his defense or his guilt. She simply continued teaching his daughter, doing the job she was hired to do with grace and confidence. "The cookies need 10 more minutes," Jasmine said professionally, wiping flour from her hands. Emma's been practicing her numbers by watching the timer. Richard loosened his tie, the weight of the day's meeting still heavy on his shoulders. "May I join you?" Emma clapped with flour-covered hands, sending white clouds into the air.
Yes.
"Miss Jasmine says you can't learn if you don't try new things." The simple wisdom in his daughter's words struck Richard. Here was his child, unencumbered by societal prejudices, learning life lessons from someone he'd been warned would damage their family's reputation. The irony wasn't lost on him. As he rolled up his sleeves to help with the cookies, Richard realized he was standing at a crossroads. He could give in to the pressure, protect his comfortable position in society, or he could stand firm, challenging not only others' preconceptions but his own. The timer dinged, and Emma rushed to peek into the oven, Jasmine's steady hand on her shoulder keeping her at a safe distance. In that moment, watching them together, Richard made his choice. Let them talk. Let them question. Some things were more important than maintaining appearances.
The
afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows of the Thompson mansion as Jasmine prepared Emma's lunch. The familiar scent of fresh bread triggered a cascade of memories, transporting her back 20 years to her grandmother's modest kitchen in South Carolina. In that memory, 5-year-old Jasmine stood on a wooden stool, watching her grandmother, Rose Carter, knead dough with strong, weathered hands. The kitchen was small but filled with warmth and the wisdom of generations. Rose worked as a housekeeper for the wealthy Marshall family, but in her own kitchen, she was queen. "Remember this, baby girl." Rose's voice echoed across time, her hands guiding young Jasmine's through the dough. "They may have bigger houses and finer things, but dignity isn't something you can buy. It's something you carry inside." That same day, Rose had returned early from work, her face tight with controlled emotion. Young Jasmine had overheard her grandmother on the phone. "No, Martha, I won't press charges. What good would it do? Mrs. Marshall may have accused me of stealing her brooch, but I know my truth. Sometimes staying silent is stronger than fighting back." The brooch had been found 2 days later, misplaced in Mrs. Marshall's jewelry box. No apology was ever offered. In the present, Jasmine's hands stilled on the sandwich she was preparing. Emma's voice broke through her reverie. "Miss Jasmine, why are you sad?" Jasmine blinked, realizing a tear had escaped. She quickly wiped it away. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. I was just remembering my grandmother. She taught me how to make the best peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in the world." "Like you're teaching me?" Emma asked, carefully spreading peanut butter on her own slice of bread. "Exactly like that." Emma worked in concentration for a moment before asking, "Miss Jasmine, why does my friend Michael's mom look worried when she sees you at school pickup?" The question caught Jasmine off guard. She had noticed the looks, the whispers, the way some parents pulled their children closer when she approached. Some things hadn't changed as much as people liked to pretend. Sometimes people worry about things they don't need to worry about, Jasmine explained, keeping her voice steady. like being scared of the dark when there's nothing there. But you can turn on a light and see there's nothing scary, Emma reasoned, her child's logic cutting through generations of prejudice. That's very wise, Emma. Sometimes grown-ups forget to turn on the light. Richard, passing by the kitchen, overheard their conversation. He lingered in the doorway, unseen, as Emma continued her questions. Is that why Tommy's mom looked angry when you helped him tie his shoes yesterday? Because she forgot to turn on the light? Jasmine measured her response carefully, aware of the weight of her words. Something like that. But you know what's important? You saw someone who needed help and you told me. You didn't worry about what Tommy's mom might think. That's being brave and kind. Richard stepped into the kitchen, making his presence known. The conversation had stirred something in him, memories of his own privileged upbringing where such discussions were carefully avoided, swept under expensive rugs in vast houses. Emma, he said, what do you think about people who look different from you? His daughter looked up from her sandwich-making project, confusion clear on her face. Different how, Daddy? Like how Miss Jasmine is taller than Mrs. Peterson was. Or how Mr. Chin at the grocery store has different eyes than you. Or how Jamie in my class uses a wheelchair. Richard caught Jasmine's eye, seeing a glimmer of approval in her expression. Any of those differences, he encouraged. Well, Emma said thoughtfully, laying her second slice of bread on top of her creation. Miss Jasmine says everybody's special in their own way. Like snowflakes. And snowflakes are pretty even, th. Oof, they're all different. Actually, they're pretty because they're all different. The profound simplicity of Emma's answer hung in the kitchen air. Richard felt something shift in his perspective, seeing the world through his daughter's unclouded eyes. Miss Jasmine, Emma continued, oblivious to the impact of her words, can you tell me about your grandmother? Did she make good sandwiches too? Jasmine smiled, the memory of Rose warming her heart. She made the best sandwiches. But more importantly, she taught me that what makes food special isn't just the ingredients, it's the love you put into making it. Like how Mommy used to cut my sandwiches into hearts? Emma asked innocently. Richard tensed at the mention of Sarah, but Jasmine handled the moment with grace. Exactly like that. Every heart sandwich was a way of saying, I love you. Can we cut these into hearts too? Emma asked, looking between Jasmine and her father. Richard stepped forward, rolling up his sleeves. I think I remember where your mother kept the heart-shaped cookie cutter. As they worked together, Richard noticed how Jasmine's presence had created a space where difficult conversations became manageable, where his daughter could process complex ideas about difference and loss through simple, honest dialogue. It was a gift he hadn't expected when he'd hired her. The afternoon light caught the grain of flour floating in the air, creating a gentle halo effect in the kitchen. In that moment, surrounded by the smell of fresh bread and his daughter's laughter, Richard realized that sometimes the biggest lessons come from the smallest moments, and that true understanding often begins in unexpected places, like a kitchen where three people from different worlds could come together over heart-shaped sandwiches and honest questions. Spring cleaning came early to the Thompson mansion. Emma had outgrown many of her toys, and Jasmine suggested donating them to a local children's shelter. While Emma sorted through her possessions, Jasmine tackled the storage room adjacent to the child's playroom, a space that hadn't been properly organized since Sarah's death. The room contained the accumulated history of the Thompson family, boxes stacked in neat but dusty rows. Jasmine worked methodically, cataloging items for donation or storage. In a corner, behind a stack of Emma's baby clothes, she found an ornate wooden box that seemed out of place among the modern storage containers. The box's brass hinges creaked as she opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs. Most were formal family portraits spanning several decades, men in suits, women in elaborate dresses, all bearing the distinct Thompson features. But one photograph, tucked behind the others, made Jasmine's hands tremble. The image was faded but clear enough, a garden party from what appeared to be the 1960s. Among the well-dressed guests stood a young black woman in a housekeeper's uniform, her face hauntingly familiar. Jasmine recognized her immediately, her grandmother, Rose Carter, decades younger but unmistakable. She stood near a group of party guests, her posture straight and dignified despite her servant's position. But it was the woman standing next to Rose that made Jasmine's breath catch. A young white woman in an elegant blue dress, her hand placed casually on Rose's arm in a gesture of familiarity that would have been shocking for that era. The woman's face bore a striking resemblance to photographs Jasmine had seen of Richard's mother. "Miss Jasmine?" Emma's voice called from the playroom. "Can you help me reach the top shelf?" Jasmine quickly slipped the photograph into her pocket, her mind racing. She had known her grandmother worked for wealthy families, but she had never mentioned the Thompsons. Why had this connection been kept secret? The casual touch between the women in the photograph suggested a relationship that went beyond employer and servant. Throughout the afternoon, the photograph burned in Jasmine's pocket like a live coal. She watched Richard during dinner, studying his features, looking for any resemblance to the woman in the blue dress. Emma chatted about her toy-sorting adventure, oblivious to Jasmine's distraction. "We found my old baby blanket," Emma announced. "The one Grandma Margaret made before she died." Richard's expression softened at the mention of his mother. "She spent months working on that blanket. Said every stitch was a wish for your happiness." Jasmine's hand unconsciously moved to her pocket. Margaret Thompson, that would have been her name. The woman in the blue dress. But what was her connection to Rose Carter? And why had neither family ever spoken of it? Later that evening, after Emma was asleep, Jasmine sat in her room at the mansion, examining the photograph under her desk lamp. She noticed details she had missed in her initial shock. The garden setting appeared to be the very same backyard where Emma now played. The rose bushes in the background, though younger in the image, were the same varieties that still bloomed there today. Her phone lay on the desk, her grandmother's number ready to dial. But something held her back. Rose was in her 80s now, and her health was fragile. Would questioning her about this long-buried past cause her unnecessary pain? And what about Richard? How would he react to learning that their families shared an unknown history? In his study, Richard was unknowingly confronting the same history. While searching for some old business documents, he had discovered another copy of the same photograph, this one tucked into his father's old ledger. He studied it with mild curiosity, his attention caught by his mother's youthful face. He had few memories of Margaret Thompson showing such unguarded warmth as she displayed in that casual touch to the housekeeper's arm. He noted the date scrawled on the back, June 15th, 1963, but failed to make any connection to his current circumstances. The housekeeper was just another face from the past, one of the many servants who had maintained the Thompson lifestyle through the generations. Yet something about the image nagged at him, a subtle recognition he couldn't quite place. Richard slipped the photograph into his desk drawer, making a mental note to ask his father about it the next time they spoke. At 87, Arthur Thompson's memory was failing, but he might recall this particular garden party. Richard had learned to navigate his father's good days carefully, extracting family history in small, manageable pieces. In the quiet of the mansion, 2 copies of the same photograph rested in different rooms, their shared secret waiting to unravel decades of carefully maintained silence. Neither Richard nor Jasmine could sleep that night, each troubled by questions they weren't yet ready to ask. The next morning, they moved around each other with careful politeness, each carrying the weight of their discovery. Emma, perceptive as always, noticed the change. "Why is everyone so quiet today?" she asked over breakfast. "Did something scary happen?" "No, sweetheart," Jasmine assured her, avoiding Richard's eyes. "Sometimes grown-ups just have a lot on their minds. Like when you're trying to solve a really hard puzzle?" Emma suggested. Richard looked up from his coffee, meeting Jasmine's gaze for the first time that morning. "Yes, exactly like that. Sometimes the pieces are right in front of us, but we can't quite see how they fit together." The metaphor hung in the air between them, more accurate than either could know. The photograph had set in motion a chain of revelations that would soon force them to re-examine everything they thought they knew about their family's history. The autumn evening settled over the Thompson mansion, bringing with it an early sunset that painted the kitchen in warm amber light. Richard stood at the counter. attempting to decode the recipe for his late wife's lasagna. Emma had requested it specifically, remembering it as her favorite comfort food. Scattered around him were ingredients in various states of disarray, a testament to his inexperience in the kitchen. Jasmine found him there, tomato sauce somehow managing to spot his typically immaculate white dress shirt. She paused in the doorway, the photograph from her grandmother's past feeling heavier than ever in her pocket. Over the past weeks, she'd carried it with her constantly, waiting for the right moment to bring it up, but the weight of potential consequences always held her back. "Would you like some help?" she offered, already rolling up her sleeves. The domestic scene before her presented such a contrast to Richard's usual corporate persona that she couldn't help but smile. Richard looked up, relief washing over his features. "Is it that obvious that I'm out of my depth?" He gestured to the chaos around him. "Sarah made it look so easy. I never thought to ask her for the recipe while." His voice trailed off, the loss still evident in his tone. Jasmine moved to the counter, gently taking the recipe card from his hands. The handwriting was delicate, faded in places where water spots had blurred the ink. "My grandmother always said cooking is just love made visible," she said, scanning the ingredients. "Tell me about Sarah's lasagna. What made it special?" As they worked side by side, Richard began to share memories of his late wife. The kitchen filled with stories of Sarah's cooking adventures, her determination to master Italian cuisine despite having no Italian heritage, her insistence on making everything from scratch. Jasmine listened, asking questions at the right moments, helping him remember the joy rather than just the loss. "Emma has her smile," Richard said softly, layering pasta sheets as Jasmine directed. "Sometimes she makes an expression, and it's like seeing Sarah all over again." "She has your determination, though," Jasmine observed, showing him how to spread the ricotta mixture evenly. "The way she tackles problems head-on. That's all you." Richard paused, considering her words. "You've noticed that about her? Most people just see her as the Thompson heiress, or worse, the poor motherless child." "I see, Emma," Jasmine said simply. "Just like my grandmother taught me to see people for who they are, not what others label them as." The photograph seemed to burn more intensely in her pocket at the mention of her grandmother. Their conversation flowed naturally as they assembled the lasagna, moving around each other in the kitchen with an ease that would have seemed impossible months ago. Richard found himself sharing his insecurities about raising Emma alone, about maintaining his company's success while being present for his daughter. "Sometimes I feel like I'm failing at both," he admitted, watching Jasmine sprinkle the final layer of cheese. "The board thinks I'm distracted, and Emma, sometimes I look at her and wonder if I'm giving her enough." Jasmine closed the oven door on their creation before turning to face him. "You know what I see? A father who left an important board meeting to attend his daughter's school play. Who learns to cook her favorite meal just because she asked. That's not failing, Richard. That's showing up." The use of his first name hung between them, a small but significant shift in their dynamic. Richard felt the weight of social expectations and class distinctions beginning to fade in the warmth of their shared moment. "Miss Jasmine, Daddy." Emma's voice carried from the hallway. "Can we have the game night now? You promised." They exchanged glances, both grateful for the interruption before the moment could become too charged with unspoken things. Emma bounded into the kitchen, already in her pajamas, clutching her favorite board game. "Perfect timing," Jasmine said, setting the kitchen timer. "The lasagna needs 45 minutes. Just enough time for one game." They gathered around the coffee table in the family room, a space that had seen little use before Jasmine's arrival. Emma insisted on being the banker, her tongue poking out in concentration as she counted play money with exaggerated care. As they played, Richard observed the easy rapport between Jasmine and Emma, the way his daughter looked to her for approval, how naturally Jasmine offered guidance without overshadowing his role as a parent. He found himself sharing glances with Jasmine over Emma's head, silent communications full of shared understanding. The timer's ding coincided with Emma's triumphant victory. As they made their way back to the kitchen, the aroma of Sarah's lasagna filled the air. Emma inhaled deeply. "It smells just like Mommy used to make." Richard and Jasmine's eyes met over Emma's head. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of how their lives had become intertwined, how the boundaries between employer and employee had blurred into something more complex. Later, after Emma was tucked into bed, they lingered in the kitchen, cleaning up in comfortable silence. Richard handed Jasmine a plate to dry, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for the lasagna, but for everything." Jasmine's hand moved unconsciously to her pocket, where the photograph lay hidden. The genuine warmth in Richard's voice made her secret feel even heavier. How could she tell him now, when they'd finally found this delicate balance? She placed the dried plate in the cabinet, buying time to steady her voice. "Emma makes it easy," she deflected. "She has a way of bringing out the best in people." "She's not the only one," Richard replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her look away. The moment stretched between them, full of possibilities and unspoken truths. Finally, Jasmine gathered her courage. "Richard, there's something I need to tell you." But before she could continue, his phone rang, the specific ringtone he used for emergency board matters. The spell broke, reality rushing back in. As Richard stepped away to take the call, Jasmine touched the photograph in her pocket once more, wondering if she'd lost her chance to bridge the gap between past and present. Thunder rolled in the distance as Jasmine paced her room in the Thompson mansion. The photograph lay on her desk, worn at the edges from weeks of handling. She had called her grandmother that morning, finally gathering the courage to ask about the garden party captured in the image. Rose's long silence before answering told Jasmine everything she needed to know. There was more to the story than a simple employer-employee relationship. "Some things are better left in the past, child," Rose had said, her voice heavy with untold stories. But then she added something that changed everything. "Margaret Thompson saved my life that summer. And I saved hers. That's all you need to know." The weight of that revelation propelled Jasmine down the hallway to Richard's study. The mansion was quiet. Emma was at a sleepover, leaving no buffer between what needed to be said. Jasmine knocked on the heavy wooden door, her heart thundering louder than the approaching storm. "Come in," Richard called. He sat behind his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed documents. Looking up, he noticed her expression. "Is everything all right?" Jasmine closed the door behind her, gripping the photograph in her pocket. "There's something I need to show you. Something I found while cleaning the storage room." Her voice remained steady despite her racing pulse. "I've been trying to find the right moment to bring it up, but I'm realizing there might not be one." Richard set aside his papers, giving her his full attention. The ease they had developed over the past months was evident in his relaxed posture, making what she had to say even more difficult. "Before I show you this," Jasmine continued, "I want you to know that I didn't seek this position because of what I discovered. I didn't even know until I found the photograph." Richard's expression shifted from concern to curiosity. "What photograph?" Jasmine withdrew the image from her pocket, smoothing its creased edges before placing it on his desk. As Richard picked it up, lightning flashed outside, illuminating the study in harsh white light. She watched his face carefully as he examined the image. At first, his expression remained neutral, merely studying his mother's younger self at what appeared to be another society gathering. Then his eyes moved to the woman beside her, and Jasmine saw the moment recognition began to dawn. "This is your mother, Margaret," Jasmine said softly. "And the woman next to her is my grandmother, Rose Carter." Richard's hands tightened on the photograph. "This doesn't make sense. My mother never mentioned." He trailed off, looking up at Jasmine with new eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. "I spoke with my grandmother this morning," Jasmine pressed on. "She told me that your mother saved her life that summer, and she saved your mother's. But she wouldn't tell me more." Richard stood abruptly, moving to the window. Thunder crackled overhead as he stared out into the darkening garden, the same garden where the photograph had been taken decades ago. "This has to be a mistake," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. "I found it in a box of old Thompson family photographs," Jasmine explained. "It was deliberately hidden behind other images. And look at how they're standing together." That kind of familiarity between a white society woman and her black housekeeper in 1963, that wasn't normal, Richard. They knew each other. Really knew each other. Stop. Richard's voice was sharp, his back still turned to her. Just stop. Jasmine fell silent, watching his shoulders rise and fall with rapid breaths. The storm outside matched the tension in the room, rain now lashing against the windows. Finally, Richard turned back to face her, his expression haunted. My mother died believing I had disappointed her. She never approved of my focus on business over family, my marriage to Sarah instead of the society matches she'd chosen. She tried to tell me something on her deathbed, but she was too weak. I never knew. He looked down at the photograph again. What aren't they telling us? I don't know, Jasmine admitted. But I think we owe it to them, and to ourselves, to find out. Richard sank back into his chair, running a hand over his face. All these months, you've been carrying this knowledge? Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I was afraid, Jasmine answered honestly. Afraid of losing my position. Afraid of hurting Emma. Afraid of what it might mean for both our families. But mostly, I was afraid of how it would change things between us. The admission hung in the air between them. Richard stared at the photograph, his finger tracing the outline of his mother's face. And now? How do you think this changes things between us? Before Jasmine could answer, Richard's phone buzzed. Emma's name flashed on the screen. She wants to come home, he said after reading the message. The storm is scaring her. I'll go pick her up, Jasmine offered automatically.
No.
Richard's voice was firm. Not tonight. Not. I need time to process this. The dismissal stung, but Jasmine understood. She moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. Richard, whatever happened between our families in the past, it doesn't change who we are now. It doesn't change how much Emma needs both of us. Richard didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the photograph. As Jasmine closed the door behind her, she heard the distinct sound of a glass being filled, the whiskey he kept in his desk drawer for difficult moments.
In
her room, Jasmine listened to the storm rage outside and the sound of Richard's car leaving to pick up Emma. She packed a small bag, unsure if she would be welcome to stay the night. The photograph remained in Richard's study, a physical reminder of the past that now stood between them like a wall. Yet as she heard them return, Emma's excited chatter about the storm, Richard's gentle responses, Jasmine knew that running away wasn't the answer. Whatever secrets lay in their family's shared past, the present held something worth fighting for. She unpacked her bag and waited for morning, hoping the light of day would bring clarity to the shadows that now clouded their carefully built relationship. Morning arrived with the aftermath of the storm, fallen leaves scattered across the Thompson estate's manicured lawns. Richard sat in his study, where he had spent most of the night, the photograph propped against his computer screen. His mother's young face seemed to watch him with knowing eyes, holding secrets he had never thought to ask about while she was alive. The mansion felt different now, as if the revelation had altered its very foundations. The breakfast routine, normally a time of comfortable interaction, had become a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. Jasmine prepared Emma's lunch with quiet efficiency while Richard buried himself in his tablet, the weekend financial reports providing a shield against conversation. Only Emma seemed unchanged, chattering about her sleepover adventure between bites of cereal. And then the thunder was so loud, but Daddy came to get me, and I wasn't scared anymore because I knew I'd get to come home to both of you. The simple statement hung in the air. Richard glanced up involuntarily, meeting Jasmine's eyes for the first time that morning. The pain and uncertainty he saw there made him look away quickly, but not before Emma noticed the exchange. "Did you have a fight?" she asked, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "Because Mrs. Peterson at school says when grown-ups don't talk to each other, it means they had a fight." "No, sweetheart," Jasmine answered, her voice gentle. "Sometimes grown-ups just need time to think about important things. Like when I'm doing a hard puzzle?" Emma persisted, using her favorite metaphor for adult complexity. Richard set down his tablet, forced to engage by his daughter's perceptiveness. "Something like that." But this is a very old puzzle, with some pieces we didn't know existed until now. Emma considered this seriously. When I lose puzzle pieces, I just make new ones. I draw them myself and color them to match.
Can't you do that?
The innocent suggestion carried more wisdom than she knew. Richard looked at Jasmine again, really looked at her for the first time since the revelation. She stood at the kitchen counter, her posture straight and dignified, just like her grandmother's in the photograph. How had he not seen the resemblance before? "It's not quite that simple, Emma," he began, but his daughter cut him off with the impatience of a child who thinks adults are making things unnecessarily complicated. "Yes, it is. If you can't fix the old puzzle, make a new one. That's what Miss Jasmine taught me. She says we can always start fresh if we need to." The words hit Richard with unexpected force. He remembered Jasmine's last words from the night before. "It doesn't change who we are now." Maybe Emma was right. Maybe they were focusing too much on the old puzzle when they should be looking at the one right in front of them. But first, he needed answers. Rising from the table, he retrieved his phone and stepped into the hallway. His father's number felt heavy under his finger as he dialed. Arthur Thompson's declining health made conversations difficult, but he was the only one left who might know the truth. The call went to voicemail, his father's morning physical therapy session. Richard left a message asking to visit that afternoon, trying to keep his voice casual despite the urgency he felt. When he returned to the kitchen, Emma had gone upstairs to get ready for school, leaving him alone with Jasmine. The silence between them felt physical, like a wall of glass, transparent but impenetrable. "I'm going to see my father today," he said finally. He might have answers about the photograph. Jasmine nodded, closing Emma's lunchbox with deliberate care. "I called my grandmother again this morning. She's willing to talk, but she wants to do it in person. She lives in South Carolina now." The implications of that statement lingered. A trip to South Carolina would mean time away from Emma, from the routine they had carefully built. But more than that, it would mean acknowledging that whatever lay in their family's past was significant enough to pursue. "I can't leave Emma," Richard said, the words coming out more defensive than he intended. "She could come with us," Jasmine suggested quietly. "Meet her, meet my grandmother. Unless you think that would be inappropriate now." The question carried weight beyond its surface meaning. What were they to each other now? Employer and employee? Two people connected by a mysterious past? Something more complicated that neither dared name? Emma's footsteps thundered down the stairs before Richard could respond. She burst into the kitchen wearing mismatched socks and carrying her favorite stuffed dragon. "I'm ready for school. Can Miss Jasmine do my hair in braids like yesterday?" The familiar request cut through the tension. Richard watched as Jasmine gathered Emma's hair with practiced gentleness, her fingers weaving patterns that his own hands could never master. His daughter's complete trust in her, the way she leaned into Jasmine's touch without hesitation, spoke volumes. "We'll figure this out," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the declaration. "Whatever happened in the past, we'll figure it out. Together." Jasmine's hands stilled for a moment in Emma's hair. "Together," she repeated, the word carrying both promise and question. As they moved through the morning routine, backpack checked, shoes tied, jacket zipped, Richard felt something shift in the atmosphere. The wall of glass hadn't shattered, but perhaps a door had appeared, offering a way through if they were brave enough to use it. Emma hugged them both before running to the waiting car, unaware of the significance of her casual embrace. As they watched her leave, Richard turned to Jasmine. "I'll speak to my father today. Once I know what he can tell us, maybe we should consider that trip to South Carolina. All of us." The smile that brightened Jasmine's face reminded him of the photograph, of the warmth captured between his mother and her grandmother in that long-ago garden. Whatever secrets lay in their shared past, the present offered its own kind of truth, one written in Emma's laughter and in moments of understanding that transcended old boundaries. Richard's visit to his father had yielded fragments of truth, pieces of a story that seemed almost impossible to believe. Now, in the quiet of the mansion's library, he sat across from Jasmine, the weight of generations hanging between them. Emma was asleep upstairs, leaving them free to finally have the conversation they both dreaded and needed. "My father remembered more than I expected," Richard began, his fingers tracing the edge of the old photograph that now lay between them on the coffee table. "He said the summer of 1963 changed everything for our family, though most people never knew why." Jasmine leaned forward, her grandmother's words from their morning phone call still fresh in her mind. "What happened that summer?" Richard took a deep breath, organizing the scattered pieces of his father's recollections. "My mother, Margaret, was involved in the civil rights movement, but secretly. She couldn't be open about it because of my grandfather's position in society. She would pass information to activists, help arrange safe houses, provide resources where she could. Your grandmother, Rose, worked in our house and became her confidant. That explains their closeness in the photograph," Jasmine said softly. "But my grandmother mentioned something about them saving each other's lives. What did she mean?" Richard's expression darkened. "There was an incident. My grandfather discovered some documents in my mother's desk, plans for a major civil rights demonstration in the city. He was furious, threatened to have her committed to an asylum for radical behavior. It wasn't uncommon then for wealthy men to have difficult wives institutionalized." Jasmine felt a chill run through her. "What happened?" "According to my father, Rose overheard the argument. She knew my grandfather's threats weren't empty. She'd seen it happen to other women in their social circle. That night, she helped my mother gather evidence of my grandfather's illegal business dealings, documentation of tax evasion and fraud that would ruin him if exposed." "Blackmail," Jasmine whispered, seeing her grandmother's strength in a new light. "Protection," Richard corrected. "Rose gave my mother leverage, a way to fight back. But it came at a terrible cost." He paused, his voice growing heavy. "Someone saw Rose going through my grandfather's office. Word got back to him." Jasmine's hand flew to her mouth. "What did he do to her?" "He sent men to her house that night. But my mother had anticipated his reaction. She'd already helped Rose's family leave town, get them safely to relatives in South Carolina. The men found an empty house, and my mother made sure my grandfather knew that if anything happened to Rose or her family, his documents would find their way to the authorities." The piece clicked into place. "That's why my grandmother moved south so suddenly. She never talked about it, just said they had to leave quickly." Richard nodded. "My mother and Rose stayed in contact through secret letters for years. My father says it changed my mother profoundly, having to acknowledge the depths of evil in her own family, seeing how privilege had blinded them all. She raised me differently because of it, though I never understood why she was so insistent about certain things until now." Jasmine sat back, processing the weight of this history. "My grandmother protected your mother at the risk of her own life. And your mother protected my family in return." "Yes." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "And I've spent the last few months unknowingly perpetuating some of the same prejudices my mother fought against. When the board members questioned my hiring you, when I let their opinions make me doubt my decision, you didn't know," Jasmine said gently. "None of us knew, but I should have been better. My mother tried to tell me, all those years ago. She would talk about integrity, about seeing people for who they really are. I thought they were just platitudes." He looked up at Jasmine, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For every moment I made you feel less than equal in this house. For every time I let others' prejudices influence how I treated you. For not seeing what was right in front of me. That you're here because you're extraordinary at what you do, just like your grandmother was extraordinary in her own way." The honesty in his voice made Jasmine's throat tight. "Richard, the past doesn't define us. What matters is what we do now, knowing what we know. The night you showed me the photograph," he said slowly, "you said you were afraid it would change things between us. You were right, it has changed things. But maybe not in the way we feared." Their eyes met across the coffee table, the photograph between them no longer a barrier, but a bridge. The silence that followed was different from the tense quiet of recent days. It was filled with understanding, with the weight of shared history and the possibility of something new. A small sound from the doorway made them both turn. Emma stood there in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed dragon. "I had a bad dream," she said in a small voice. Without hesitation, both Richard and Jasmine moved to comfort her. As they settled on the couch together, Emma between them, the little girl noticed the photograph on the table. "Who are they?" she asked sleepily. Richard and Jasmine exchanged a look over her head. "That's your grandmother, Margaret," Richard said softly, "and Miss Jasmine's grandmother, Rose. They were very brave women who helped each other when things were difficult." "Like how you and Miss Jasmine help each other?" Emma asked, already drifting back to sleep. "Yes," Richard answered, his eyes meeting Jasmine's. "Exactly like that." As Emma's breathing deepened into sleep, they sat in companionable silence, the photograph watching over them like a benediction from the past. The truth of their family's connection had shaken their world, but in its place, something stronger was beginning to grow, an understanding built on honesty, respect, and the courage to face the past together. The South Carolina sun beat down on the rental car as Richard, Jasmine, and Emma made their way through winding country roads. They had decided to visit Rose first, her age making time a precious commodity. The GPS led them to a modest but well-maintained house on the outskirts of Charleston, its wraparound porch adorned with hanging ferns and rocking chairs that spoke of generations of family gatherings. Rose Carter stood waiting for them, her silver hair caught in the afternoon light. Despite her 87 years, she stood straight and tall, dignity emanating from her like a tangible force. Emma was the first out of the car, her natural friendliness overriding any awkwardness the adults might feel. "You look just like Miss Jasmine in the old picture," Emma announced, studying Rose's face with unabashed curiosity. "The one where you're standing with my other grandmother." Rose's eyes crinkled with warmth as she bent slightly to meet Emma's gaze. "And you, child, have Margaret Thompson's eyes. Come sit with me on the porch. I have lemonade waiting, made from lemons right off my own tree." As they settled into the rocking chairs, the afternoon stretching lazy and golden around them, Rose reached for a weathered wooden box beside her chair. "I've been keeping these safe for a long time," she said, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Waiting for the right moment, the right people to share them with. Inside lay a collection of letters, their pages yellowed with age, but carefully preserved. "Margaret and I wrote to each other for 30 years, Rose explained, selecting one from the stack. "At first, we had to be careful. Her husband would have destroyed them if he'd found them. Later, after he passed, we wrote more openly." Richard leaned forward, recognizing his mother's elegant handwriting. The letter was dated 1964, a year after the incident that had forced Rose to flee. "My dearest Rose, the house feels empty without you, though I know your leaving was the only way to keep you safe. Father suspects nothing about the documents. His pride would never allow him to imagine a mere servant could outsmart him so thoroughly. But you and I know better, don't we? You taught me more about courage in one night than I learned in all my years of privileged education." The children at the new school seemed to be adjusting well. "I made sure the donation was anonymous, as you suggested. It's a small step toward repaying the debt our family owes to yours, though no amount of money could ever truly balance those scales. I think often of our conversations in the kitchen, how you helped me see beyond the walls of my gilded cage. You showed me that true friendship knows no bounds of race or class. That courage often comes in quiet moments of choosing right over easy. Keep this letter safe, dear friend. Someday, when the world is ready, our grandchildren might understand what we tried to build here, a bridge across the divide that others worked so hard to maintain. With love and gratitude." Margaret Richards' hands shook as he finished reading. "She never told me any of this. I knew she supported civil rights, but this was so much more." Rose nodded, selecting another letter from the box. Margaret was determined to make change from within. She used her position, her privilege, to open doors that would have remained closed otherwise. The school mentioned in that letter? It was one of the first in the area to integrate, thanks to her anonymous funding. "But why keep it secret for so long?" Jasmine asked, watching Emma play with Rose's cat on the porch steps. "Why not tell us about this connection?" Rose's expression grew distant. "Fear is a powerful thing, child. Even after Thomas Thompson died, his influence lingered. Margaret worried that revealing too much might still put people at risk. And then, as years passed, we both realized that some stories need to wait for the right time, the right generation to hear them. She handed another letter to Richard, this one from 1980. "Read this one. I think you'll understand better." The paper crackled as Richard unfolded it. "Dearest Rose, Richard graduates from college next month. You should see him, so full of potential, yet so certain he already knows everything. I see him struggling between the world of privilege he was born into and the values I've tried to instill. Sometimes I wonder if I should tell him about you, about that summer that changed everything. But I worry that he's not ready yet, that the weight of our family's history might burden rather than liberate him. Perhaps it's better to let him find his own way to understanding. Your Jasmine must be starting school now. Imagine if they were to meet someday, these grandchildren of ours. Would they recognize in each other the same spirit of justice that brought us together? Would they understand that the barriers between people are built of fear and ignorance, not truth? I've enclosed a photograph from that last garden party. Keep it safe with the others. Someday, when the time is right, it might help tell her story. With eternal friendship, Margaret." "There are dozens more," Rose said softly, watching emotions play across Richard's face. "Letters spanning decades, documenting not just our friendship, but the quiet work of change." Margaret used her wealth and position to support civil rights initiatives across the South, always anonymously, always guided by our conversations about what was really needed. She was building a legacy, Jasmine realized, but not the kind people usually think of, not money or property, but one of understanding and change. "Yes," Rose agreed. "And now you two have found each other, just as she hoped you might. Though I doubt either she or I could have predicted little Miss Emma, there would be the bridge between you." Emma looked up at the sound of her name, abandoning the cat to climb into Jasmine's lap. "Can we read more letters? I like stories about brave grandmothers." "First," Rose said, reaching deeper into the box, "there's something else you need to see. Something that might explain why Margaret was so dedicated to this cause, why she risked everything to protect our family." She withdrew a single sheet of paper, more official-looking than the letters. Richard took it with trembling hands, his eyes widening as he read. When he looked up, his face had lost all color. "This is impossible," he whispered. "This changes everything." Richard stared at the document in his hands, an old birth certificate from 1942. The paper was yellowed, its edges worn, but the information it contained was clear enough to shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew about his family. Next to him, Jasmine leaned closer, her eyes widening as she read over his shoulder. "My mother," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was biracial?" Rose nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap. Margaret's mother was a young Black woman named Elizabeth Williams. She worked as a maid in the Thompson household in the 1940s. Thomas Thompson's father, your great-grandfather, was the master of the house then. But how? Richard struggled to form the words. How did she pass as white? How did no one know? Elizabeth died in childbirth, Rose explained, her voice gentle but firm. Thomas Thompson's wife, who couldn't have children of her own, claimed Margaret as hers. In those days, it wasn't uncommon for wealthy families to suddenly produce a child, and no one dared question the Thompsons. Margaret was raised as white, never knowing her true heritage until she was grown. That's why she was so passionate about civil rights, Jasmine realized. She wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting for her own identity. Yes, Rose confirmed. She discovered the truth when she was 25. Found papers in her father's study, much like the ones you found, Richard. That's when she began her work, quietly at first, then more boldly as she gained confidence. When she hired me as housekeeper, she recognized something in me. Another woman fighting against the constraints society placed on us. We became more than employer and employee. We were sisters in the struggle. Emma, who had been quietly playing nearby, moved to sit at Richard's feet. Does this mean you and Miss Jasmine are really family, Daddy? The innocent question hung in the air. Richard looked at the birth certificate again, then at Jasmine, seeing her in a completely new light. The features he'd attributed to coincidence, her quiet dignity, her innate understanding of his daughter, the inexplicable sense of connection they'd felt from the beginning, suddenly made sense in a deeper way. "We're all connected," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Our families have been intertwined for generations, through pain and secrecy, but also through courage and love." Margaret carried such guilt, Rose continued, about passing as white, about benefiting from privilege while others suffered. But she channeled that guilt into action. Every civil rights initiative she supported, every family she helped, every child she put through school, it was her way of acknowledging and honoring her heritage. "The letters," Jasmine said suddenly. She knew that someday the truth would come out. She was leaving us a trail to follow, breadcrumbs that would lead us here, to this moment. Richard stood abruptly, moving to the porch railing. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, nature's reminder that beauty could come from the blending of different colors. "All my life," he said, "I've been proud of being a Thompson, of our family's position in society. Now I learn that position was built on lies, on the erasure of part of our own family." Rose's voice carried across the porch, strong and clear.
"No, child.
"Your position was built by a woman who took her pain and turned it into purpose. Margaret didn't just pass as white. She used her position to create change, to build bridges where others built walls. She understood that true legacy isn't about maintaining appearances. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." Emma, with a child's perfect timing, broke the heavy moment. "Can we have more lemonade? And maybe Miss Jasmine can help me write our family story?" For school, the adults exchanged glances, something settling between them. The weight of history was still there, but it felt different now. Not a burden to bear, but a foundation to build upon. "Of course, sweetheart," Jasmine said, her eyes meeting Richard's. "But it's not just my story to tell anymore. It's our story." Richard moved back to join them, picking up the birth certificate with new reverence. "Mom tried to tell me that last day in the hospital. She kept saying, 'The truth is in the letters.' I thought it was the medication talking." "She knew you were ready," Rose said softly. "She saw how you were raising Emma, how you were beginning to question the old ways. And then when Jasmine came into your lives, it was like Margaret herself had orchestrated it from beyond." As the evening settled around them, they began to read more letters, piecing together the full story of Margaret Thompson, daughter of a maid and a wealthy man, secret champion of civil rights, and bridge between two worlds. Emma fell asleep on the porch swing, her head in Jasmine's lap, while Richard and Rose continued to talk, filling in the gaps of their shared history. The final letter they read was dated just a month before Margaret's death. "My dearest Rose, I feel my time growing short, but my heart is at peace. I've seen Richard becoming the man I hoped he would be, though he doesn't yet understand the full truth of his heritage. When the time comes, when he's ready, share our story with him. Help him understand that the greatest privilege we have is the ability to make positive change in the world. I dream sometimes of our grandchildren meeting, of them recognizing in each other what we found in our friendship, the truth that family is not about blood or social position, but about love and understanding. The walls between people are beginning to crumble, but there is still work to be done. Perhaps they will be the ones to build something new on the foundation we laid. Keep watching over them, my friend. And remember me not as Margaret Thompson, society woman, but as who I truly was, a daughter of two worlds, trying to bring them together. With eternal love and gratitude." Margaret, as Richard folded the letter, his hand found Jasmine's across the sleeping form of his daughter. In that touch was understanding, forgiveness, and the promise of something new, a future built on truth rather than pretense, on acceptance rather than fear. Rose watched them with satisfaction, seeing in their joined hands the fulfillment of Margaret's final wish. The past could not be changed, but its lessons could light the way forward. And in Emma's peaceful sleep, in the easy way she accepted both sides of her newly expanded family, lay the hope for a future where such divisions would matter less and less.